Hi, my name is Ann Wohlcke. I'm a history professor at Cal Poly Pomona. I'm a specialist in early modern English history, which means the 16th through the 18th centuries. And I am interested in looking at connections between history and astrology. David is always looking at history when he looks at astrological forecasts and has discussions about the astrology of the time, of today. And I'm actually interested in looking at whether or not astrology can teach us anything about history.
Hi, I'm David Palmer. I'm also known as the Leo King. I'm a celebrity astrologer and evolutionary astrologer. I'm also the CEO and co-founder of highvibe.tv, which is an awesome spiritual platform combining daily video horoscopes, different lectures that I do. We have lots of other talent in the metaphysical and spiritual arts that also provide content. I also run a full television studio, music studio that brings all of this knowledge to the world. And I also tour and do talks about bringing the history to life through astrology and showing people the understanding of Hermeticism, which is also known as Hermetic alchemy, that was practiced during the 15th, the 16th, and the 17th century time period especially. And really I'm all about bridging the current world to the old world and making it understood in a more modern way.
King James was King of Scotland during the 16th century, and he became King of England in 1603 when Queen Elizabeth I died, and he was the nearest successor. James came to the throne because he was related to the Tudor family through the female line. He was related to the Tudors through Henry VIII's sister. His father was also connected to the Tudor family, but he was a member of the Stuart family. And so when King James came to the throne, the family line switches from the Tudors to the Stuarts. England was one of the few places in Europe where you could inherit the throne through a female, through the female line. And I always have thought that's ironic because Henry VIII caused a whole split with the Roman Catholic Church because he wanted to divorce his wife, his first wife Catherine, because he was not having a male child who lived past infancy. And so he did whatever it took to get a new wife. And in the end, he ends up having a male child who does become King of England, and that's Edward VI. But Edward dies when he's just a teenager still. And then his Henry VIII's first wife's daughter, Mary, becomes queen. And then we have Elizabeth, who becomes queen. So after all of that worry, and after splitting with the church, England still ends up with a female monarch. And that's because they did have the tradition that you could inherit the throne through a woman. James would have had the best people teaching him, who taught him to be a real Renaissance man. He learned all the classics. He knew how to speak Latin and French and many languages. He prided himself later on in life for his learning. He also enjoyed writing. He styled himself a poet, and I guess he also probably loved great music. At the same time, he was very Scottish in that he loved to hunt. He spent hours hunting. He was supposed to have been a person who was really intelligent. His mind was very fast, and he spent a lot of time doing all of these fun sporting type activities like hunting. And he would tell people the reason he spent so much time at hunting when he was criticized about it. He said the reason he spent so much time hunting is because he was so smart that he could get more done in an hour than anybody else. Well, when James became King of England, he maintained being King of Scotland. So he was King James VI of Scotland and King James I of England. And so he was proud of the fact that he brought the two states together, and then he called himself the King of Britain, right? Because Scotland and England are both on the Isle of Britain. So he was the first monarch who was king of both England and Scotland.
I'm going to go through his birth chart to help understand what he would have been like more as a person from an astrological point of view. We have to remember that he was around in the calendar system of the Julian calendar. So what you've always known in astrology when it comes to your birthday, especially during modern times right now, here in the 21st century, the dates are going to be a little bit different than the ones that you would commonly know as if you were to go in the newspaper to read your horoscope or to understand the zodiac sign that you were born under. He was born in the Julian calendar system on June 19th, 1566 at 9:10 a.m. in Edinburgh of Scotland back then. And so if we take a look at his chart, it's interesting that he's a Cancer. Now, the reason why I say it's interesting because in our system today, as time, the Gregorian calendar system, he would be a Gemini. But he was a Cancer, and being a Cancer, as a male especially, his emotions, his foundation, and the way that he is brought about his family is very conditioned in who he is as a person. Also, if we take a look at his chart, we always want to look at the moon. The sun and the moon are the king and the queen, we like to say in astrology, and his moon's in Leo. So a sun in Cancer and a moon in Leo. He's very passionate and very flamboyant about his personality, his emotion. He's very passionate as a person. But underneath all that passion is a very deep conditioning, also about security and safety and wanting to take care of others and provide some sort of nurturing element to the people in his life or the surroundings. But also his surroundings are very important to him. He likes to stay protected. He likes to stay safe, but is willing to leave that safety in order to pronounce some sort of emotional passion of his, something that he really loves, creativity-wise, all the way to anything that he deems to be important, almost as like God-like, which is interesting since he is the creator of the King James Bible that so many people use today. He was also born with a very harsh transit of Mars and Saturn together, and in medieval astrology, which was practiced during the times in which King James IV was born, Mars and Saturn have to deal with the malefic planets. And malefic planets meaning that they bring a lot more challenge, a lot more, sometimes even evil energies. But while in Leo, it's very passionate. Leo is the lion, the courage, and also one that roars. And so with Mars and Saturn here, he can be very focused. So the positive element of this is the goals that he wants in his life, he identifies with them extremely. So anything that he goes after, he puts his identity behind it. But also besides that, he also sets goals and does not stop from making them happen. People born with this alignment are people that are very strong and very tough when it comes to moving in the direction that they want and making sure that it is going to happen. Now, we always look at somebody's Venus to understand how they love people and the things that he values in his life or the client. For him, he has Venus in Taurus, which would be the domicile position, meaning this is the home for Venus in Taurus. So his values are very important to him. He also has things to where when it comes to his relationships, the ones that are the most important to him are everything. The people that are not, well, they can kind of take second, third, or fourth place and put a lot more attention into the people in the time of wherever he's at in his life that he finds worthy, especially to his mission and especially to those things that I brought up earlier about how powerful he is when it comes to defining himself in his goals. So anybody who did not go along with his goals, did not value his goals, pretty much the old term, off with your head, would kind of be something that energetically he would put out. And it's interesting that we see a very hard square here between Venus and to Mars and Saturn. So that's a very tough transit when it comes to relationships because there's a lot of lessons that have to be learned. There's a lot of wanting to push forward into his goals, his relationships, or the things that he likes, but there's always that Saturn there to remind him of, okay, it's going to take some time. Okay, there's going to be a delay. So I would say that there would have been a lot of frustrations for him throughout his life about achieving these goals through either people that maybe he didn't think were strong enough or willing enough to push as hard as he does. At the same time, also this kind of inner resistance over things that he doesn't like, making sure that he does something about it. He creates some sort of identity about what he doesn't like. And so it's kind of a mixed bag where you get the things he loves very dearly, he's going to pronounce with that moon in Leo and that sun in Cancer with some sort of really positive energy, which I think we see more in the King James Version of the Bible. And then, of course, there's the opposite, which he was also the publisher of a 3-book series of Demonology, which is the things that he did not like. And he was very pronounced about those things as well. And I would say just looking at the combination of these planets would be very important.
In 1589, James decided, and people around him decided, it would be a good time for him to get married. The most suitable wife for him was the princess in Denmark. So he is married by proxy, actually, because she was in Denmark, and he was so excited and ready to get married that James and Anne were married by proxy. So that meant she stayed in Denmark, he was in Scotland, and on each side they each had somebody standing in as the other person, and then they were married that way. After the marriage, James became very anxious and wanted to get his princess over to Scotland, and so he decided that he was going to go to Denmark to get her. But the reason he ended up going to Denmark is because there were storms at sea on the North Sea, and she was not able to make it over to Scotland. So because there were these storms at sea that prevented Anne from being able to make it, she actually did leave with her ships once, and they had to turn back because there was a storm at sea. James, on the other side, got impatient. He went out and made it eventually over all of these stormy seas. But because of the way the storms had come up and prevented James from being able to get over to Denmark, he decided that witches must have been the cause of this. There were some infamous witches around that time in one region of Scotland, and he actually believed that they were the ones who caused these storms and prevented Anne from coming over. During the 1590s, during the time of the witch trials that James presided over, he started to write the book that became later Demonology. So people are often surprised that James, commissioned the Bible on one hand, but also on the other hand, he wrote himself this huge book on witchcraft and Satanism, and how do you find witches? How do you persecute them? Where could they be hiding? What kind of damages do they do in society? His book actually wasn't, it wasn't like a completely new idea for him to write something like that, because there were handbooks about how to uncover witches. The most famous one was The Witch's Hammer. That was a German book that was written much earlier, so he would have been aware of that. But this is James deciding he was going to use all of his knowledge and write this very scientific treatise. To him, to a lot of people, it's science, because what this is doing is telling people that if you believe there are witches, it's not enough just to accuse someone. You have to now find evidence. And so he's writing, here is what the evidence could be. And here are the types of people that could be witches. So in doing that, it's actually giving him a lot of power in Scotland, because it comes out in 1597 while he's still king in Scotland. And that's a way to enforce the social order. And remember, this is Scotland, where he doesn't have as much power as the monarch. He's not an absolute monarch. His power is always contested, so it would make more sense for him to try to kind of gain power by undermining something about society, and then society looks towards him for the answer. And so the fact that he has this gift of a book for his people, look, here's how you can uncover evil amongst you, that is a way for him to gain a little more authority in Scotland. Not to mention, helping to increase the fear of witches at the same time, because this is an era where thousands of people were executed in Scotland for being witches. Not just tried, but also many people were executed. Demonology was very influential at its time, and it helped people kind of categorize the ideas of what was demonic and what types of demons and evil were out there. So it would have been influential in introducing those ideas to England in particular, especially after he became king, because people were aware that the book existed. And I can't think of a particular trial that would have been necessarily influenced by that book, but the influence of the book within the wider culture is very important. And one of the reasons is that it goes back to William Shakespeare again, that Shakespeare was one of the king's players, right? He wrote plays for the king. And Shakespeare then knew that the king had this interest in demons and demonology, and so this was very instrumental in the characters of the three witches in Macbeth. So people would have encountered, actually I should go back and say, and other Shakespeare plays that were written after Macbeth are filled with these ideas of witches and demons that come from James's own work. Since obviously James is paying the paycheck for William Shakespeare, so of course it's going to be full of things that are influenced by the things that James is interested in. So I would say what's most influential that comes out of demonology is the way that it enters culture and the way that it becomes very popular in plays and pamphlets. These stories about witches become very popular and influential, and it's not just stories, but there are prints of witches, lots of ways people would have encountered the ideas. And that's what was so influential, is that it became part of English culture, all of these ideas about what was demonic and who could be a witch. In the 1590s, when he accused these women of being witches, he presided at some of the witch trials himself. So imagine the king coming to town in this little village in Scotland, and he comes to town just to try these women who were accused of being witches. That's how important that he thought it was, and detrimental to, overall Scotland. There's been a long-standing conspiracy that William Shakespeare was not actually William Shakespeare, that it must have been somebody who was more elite than William Shakespeare. And there is a variety of people who've been, thought to possibly be the person who actually wrote Shakespeare's sonnets and plays. The reason is that at the time, it was believed that you had to be super highly educated in order to write something that Shakespeare, like what Shakespeare wrote. And that's one reason that so many people have been looking for who was really Shakespeare. Also, we know so little about William Shakespeare. We know when he was baptized, and we don't really even know when he was born. And there's just a little bit of evidence. There's his will. We know that he gave his bed to his wife when he died. We know those sorts of little things, but we don't have a lot of evidence of, I am William Shakespeare and I'm collecting a commission for this play, and it's, here's what I wrote, right? So there's room to create a conspiracy. Personally, I believe that there was a William Shakespeare, and I feel like it's a really elitist belief that came out of this old tradition of believing that somebody who was just regular middle-class guy couldn't have written what Shakespeare wrote. But he existed. William Shakespeare was a real person. Well, when James became King of England, he maintained being King of Scotland. So he was King James VI of Scotland and King James I of England. And so he was proud of the fact that he brought the two states together, and then he called himself the King of Britain, right? Because Scotland and England are both on the Isle of Britain. So he was the first monarch who was king of both England and Scotland.
He also was born with a Mercury retrograde, which, even if you've never followed astrology before, I'm sure you've heard the term of Mercury retrograde. He has it in Cancer. So he's already different in the way that he speaks. He's not like the average person in how he speaks or how he communicates. It was said, I think, when I had some discussions earlier with Anne about him having a very enlarged tongue, to even the way that maybe he spoke had a lot of emotion into it. It was almost like everything inside of him emotionally would be communicated extremely. And sometimes even, especially with the moon in Leo, since the moon rules the emotions, and having Mercury here in the emotional house of Cancer means that they would be dramatized extremely. So I would call him a very dramatic, emotional person with very intense value systems, that he will do anything to get them out there and also push up against anything that he did not like. Looking also at his chart, there's just a couple last things. He was born with the North Node in Scorpio. These are the lunar nodes of the moon. And then the South Node in Taurus. What these lunar nodes are, the old word for node in Latin is knot. There are these invisible knots that are on the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the path in which the sun and the moon are, and what we also see, the planets, from our view of Earth. So when we look from east to west, when we watch the sun rise and its set, we are able to see this beautiful ecliptic, meaning we always know where the sun and the moon's path is going to be. We also see the planets that happen to be on this path. That is why the 12 zodiac signs happen to be in correlation. There's many more zodiacs, but we have to understand that these 12 are in the band of the ecliptic line. And every 18 months, we see these lunar knots that are invisible move. And this is how scientists and astronomers know where eclipses are going to be. But they also are a way spiritually to understand the connectivity that there is with people into this universe. Or if we look at it kind of like from the movie The Matrix, I would say it would be like something like, this is the connecting force of how he connects to this reality. And it would be very, hard with his South Node in Venus there, because it would be like he would do everything he could to just do the things of pleasure, the things that he really loves, the things that he enjoys, and almost maybe being a little bit too hard-edged about that. Could be also obsessive about certain of his relationships, and also have an obsession with the relationship, where he has a North Node in Scorpio, where there's this other part of him where his destiny is to try and expose what he defines as his truth, the things that he finds that are dark, the things that he finds that he needs to bring light to. So it's a very extreme personality born with these. So somebody who's very black and white, not a lot of gray. There is not much gray with him at all. And since, outer planets were not something that at his time of birth were even known about, it's interesting to see him have outer planets and placements that people in today's world don't have, like Pluto in Pisces and Neptune in Gemini. These are just not placements that we see, since Neptune's on a 165-year transit around the sun, and then we also see Pluto with a 248-year cycle around the sun. So, having these here, they're actually in a square, which is a very difficult aspect of a 90-degree angle, meaning that there's an obsession about spirituality, an obsession about his almost intuitive guidance, but it's very heady, it's very sometimes almost mystical, and for a way to him to try to bridge these together can be very difficult. Sometimes it could be subconsciously done. Sometimes it could even be made up in many ways, in the sense of him feeling like he's being called from some sort of spirit, or being told to say things without maybe checking to make sure that, is it true or not? And so those are some of the big aspects that I would pick up from his chart right away. This is where we start to see this going after witches and talking about how witches are creating some sort of evil to go against the king. And it's interesting, at that time period, I did pick 1579. I am able to, as an astrologer, know the math. So it's a very interesting time, because we have Neptune in Cancer. And again, this is also Neptune very close to where King James was born with his son. So this would be a very big time where he would be almost, I guess you could say, feeling like he was in the movie Poltergeist a little bit. feeling like, you know, there's these evil spirits after him, also getting lost in the emotions of what feels like he can feel things from the other side or feel things from outside the veil. And the collective would have felt very sensitive over security, or emotional issues would have been enhanced very extremely without them knowing. They didn't even know Neptune was there at that time. But it's interesting because it was a time of Saturn in Aquarius on either of those years with the planet Uranus. These both are the planets that rule Aquarius. So Aquarius is ruled by the planet Saturn. Uranus, of course, was found in the 1700s with a telescope. The first telescope that was able to find a planet outside of Saturn's reach. But this is very interesting from an astrological point of view from modern times, because the two rulers of this sign happen to be in this sign, which would have been a time of really trying to understand where the world's going next, trying to understand, how is society really going to be figured out, and where do people get placed in society? And it would be major changes in how society operates, and especially being at the turn of the century that would come up, right? Coming into the 17th century, that would have been a major turn, because that was a time where the Renaissance period had really run a lot of intense parts of its course, and it would ramp up even more. And so society was trying to figure out so many different parts of where it was going, especially the foundations, the emotions, people starting to be able to express themselves in different ways that we had never seen before. And so this would have been a time where expression was going on in every different area and every different corner of the planet. In the case of these witch trials, it would have definitely been a weird time dealing with, especially more in King James' personality. It would have been more expressed through him, through feeling like there's something weird going on the spirit world. That's what Neptune represents. Now, not only were the witch trials happening at that time, of course, but right after that, we get into him starting to write his series of books, Demonology, which he also at the same time, you'd think that the King James version of the Bible would have been first, but actually he went into the Demonology books first. And so in 1591, on May the 29th, around that time, we start to see somewhere in there the Demonology writing. So this is where he starts writing, and this would have been a very intense time, because right after that time that we had seen just prior to that, we start to see almost after a decade later, we do start to see him switch into Saturn in Gemini times. Now, Saturn in Gemini times is definitely a time where people start to put everything into writing, starting to find different ways of communication, but also it's about bringing authority through communication. So at this time would have been a time where people who were making writings were trying to create authority, trying to create their big goals through it. And honestly, if I look at this time period and I understand what was going on astrologically, this would have been what he thought was everything to him at the time. This would have been the most important project of his life. This would have been the most important thing that he had sought to seek out ever before, especially probably for the fact that, some of the history says that he was a poet and he did that for his wife. This would have been like poetic justice. This would have been some sort of deeper meaning to the poetry that he enjoyed, but what much more of his own personal experiences, his own personal needs and wants to feel safe with the North Node at that time collectively being in Cancer. And that's, again, another thing. He's a Cancer. Neptune was in Cancer during the time when he started to get part of the witch trials. He's even part of some of the witch trials and showed up to them. But then, of course, again, now a North Node in Cancer, a bunch of Gemini stuff. This is definitely, every time we start seeing through the history of King James, there's a lot of Cancer activity, and he was a Cancer, very emotionally involved. This would have been a very major time during this period when he wrote it. It was also a very weird asteroid called Chiron in Taurus, which is also where people feel somewhat like they need to prove themselves, and they never are able to, or they feel like they always get, nobody understands their value systems, and to him, his values are everything. This would have been Chiron on his south node exactly. He had that south node there at 21 degrees. And it would have been very interesting because Chiron is a slow asteroid in the sign of Taurus. And so this would have been definitely the time during his writings, even though it took a while to get these books published. This would have been this feeling of he's never seen the way he wants to be seen, especially when it comes to his value system. So this would have been his true values that he felt that needed to come out. Now, you have to skip forward because after 1591 in Julian calendar, you get to 1597 when it looks like the publishing in Demonology comes out. And by the time we're at the publishing, look at this, is the exact year that Chiron comes into Cancer. Another weird thing, another very rare thing. Chiron's on a 50-year cycle, and it goes around the sun in 50 years, but it's very interesting because Chiron sits in between Saturn and Uranus, if we look at it from an astronomical point of view. Then that makes it a weird energy. Since it is an asteroid, it does have almost like a planetary feel. Since it does revolve around the sun, it almost looks like it became a planet, but almost a failed planet. And with Chiron coming into Cancer, it would have been this publishing for him that felt like it was healing himself. Like this would have felt like I had these things to give me the authority, the poetic justice I want in my life, and this is healing me. This would have been a major relief for him, but at the same time, it also would have been a feeling of some sort of like crushed emotional state or crushed feeling that would have been, needing to be repaired. And this was like his Band-Aid. This was like his feeling deep inside that, you know what, I've fixed my bandages and I have fixed my wounds through putting out this series of books. Also at that time, it would have been Saturn and Virgo. It would have been a very intense time because the South Node was there. We actually saw a transit with the South Node in Saturn. If you just want to use in the time that we are filming this in 2020, we saw it in 2019. Not in Virgo, but in Capricorn. But it's a time where it's a very deep, stressful time. Things feel slower. Things feel like they're changing in the structures of life, and this would have been somewhat of a time where people were feeling a little bit frustrated, and maybe this gave them some sort of relief, or it scared them a lot. So it would have been a time for him where he felt that he needed to put something out there that would bring more authority to things, especially giving power to the churches, or giving power to the priests at the time, to have some sort of guidance book of how to deal with these things that deal with the things and the terms that are described in demonology. So it would have been a very harsh time as well, because Saturn and the South Node seem to be very harsh. Everything feels a little bit more flatlined in the world. It doesn't seem like a glowing rainbow world. It seems more like a dull and darker place. And so it kind of makes sense to me that this book would come out at this time. It almost would have been the feelings of, well, there's that now, and this is exactly how I feel during this times. And it actually probably would have sold better if it was in today's world. It also at that time would have been received better because people were already feeling low and already feeling melancholy, and this book would have been the opposite of an antidepressant, but would have been pushing people even farther down into the melancholy feeling even more to receive it. And when it comes to King James, after he publishes this Demonology series, is when he actually does then become the King of England. So he becomes King James I. Now, he does that on March 24th of 1603. And this was a big deal since he was now the King of England and the King of Scotland. And so this is where we actually start to see in more modern times the bridging of the United Kingdom in essence, because we start to see a king of both. And even though there was times where there was kings of both prior, it was usually fought through wars or was fought through takeovers, but this is where it was done by decree. It was done by how he was as a monarch, and the bloodlines of both Scotland and England happened to run to him. So it would have been a major transformational experience in time, not only for himself, but for both countries at the time, to have the same king. And if we look at that time, that would have been Neptune, which had entered into Virgo. This would have definitely felt like there was some sort of major change in the purity of things. It would have also made people have to realize that reality is changing in a way that they don't understand. It would have probably been difficult for people to understand what's going on, like how is this happening? Or people just also at the same time would have just had to accept the whole feeling of this is a reality that feels very foreign to me. It feels very unknown of how this happened. And there would have also been a lot of trust issues. There would have been a feeling of, are we being deceived? Is this reality really changing in the right direction? And so people would have had a lot of questions, but it wouldn't have been spoken as much. Pluto and Aries would have been a very intense time of redefining things. And so people would have just been like, well, we've seen so many things redefined through this Renaissance period and through coming into this new century, because you have to remember at that time that would have been people experiencing the change of a century, that it makes sense. It's almost like if you go back into your life and you think of when we came into the year 2000, when we started to see DVDs and we started to see, you know, it just reminds me of, I don't know, it reminds me of like seeing how many lights in Japan and how many lights in Vegas, and the world was technologically advanced and the iMac was coming out and there was just so many things. It was like, that makes sense, we're moving into a new century. We also had the fears of Y2K. Well, at that time, the fear would have been like, what does this new identity look like? Like, am I going to be okay? That would have been a big deal. Like, wow, there's a king of both countries. Are both countries just going to be the same country? How can he do both? Also Uranus and Taurus, which is very interesting since we are in 2020 with Uranus and Taurus. Uranus and Taurus is always known as the cycle from, in most recent history, especially during the 20th century, of when Hitler took his power and ran with it all the way through World War II. Uranus and Taurus dealt with also financial crisis at the same time. And so it would have been interesting to see if this would have created financial crisis at the time, or how he dealt with finances, because it would have been almost like people would have been feeling like the financials would have been changing in the world, or how currency was going to happen between England and Scotland, and if there would have had to have been a new negotiation on trade, or if there would have had to have been some new negotiation on how the money exchanges would have had to have been done then. We were able to use money from England now to go into Scotland if it's the same king. These would have been big things that would have been coming up. Now on his coronation, where he is crowned actually the King of England, because this is a very big moment because it's still a lot of the same energy. It's only months apart. This is July 25th of 1603, and there's Mars in Cancer. And I think that it's interesting because it's exactly to where the sun was when he was born. This would have given him a lot of feeling of power. To have a coronation and have Mars on your sun, Mars takes 2 years to come around the sun, and to have this on him at his coronation would have made him feel extremely powerful. Also at the same time, it was the South Node and the North Node making a return, and because he was born with the North Node in Scorpio and the South Node here in Taurus, and we have the Uranus South Node conjunction, and we have Saturn and North Node conjunction, and we have Jupiter here in Scorpio. This would have been a very big time for him, because this is when he is stepping into his greatest power, his greatest feeling, that he's going to change the world. That's the big feeling of Scorpio, this transformation, this metamorphosis. And it would have been a metamorphosis of the world, and it literally was by him being crowned King of England at that time, while also being the King of Scotland.
So in England, there was an English Bible, and that was different because in the Roman Catholic Church, the Bible was always in Latin. And one of the issues the Protestants had is that the Bible isn't accessible if it's in Latin. It's not accessible to all people. And you have to depend on a priest to be the intermediary between God and people. And so Protestants, and including Martin Luther, who's the German who started the whole Reformation in Europe, he translated a Bible into German. So there was this big movement amongst Protestants to get the Bible translated into the language of the people. So Elizabeth did have, they did have a Bible. And also in Scotland, they would have been reading an English Bible. And the problem is that the Bible wasn't really, really great, right? It wasn't a great translation. It wasn't very engaging. And it also could have been critiqued because some of the translations weren't exactly correct. So King James, when he became monarch in England, he commissioned a new translation of the Bible. Pretty quickly after becoming monarch in 1604, there was a conference, and at that conference, he brought together a group of people who were going to become the secretaries who would actually translate the Bible. And he would have thought that was very important to get as close to the original as possible. He was very scholarly, as I said, and so he wanted the Bible to be really as close to the Word of God as possible. And at the same time, he wanted a Bible that was more poetic. So those people who he commissioned to write the Bible were also writing in a style that was very similar to Shakespeare. Remember, this is the era of William Shakespeare, and King James very much liked theater. I mean, in fact, he made Shakespeare's acting company called the King's Men because he enjoyed them so much. So the Bible that he had written is very full of beautiful language, so that today when we talk about the Bible, you know, or when people quote the Bible today, often it's the King James Version, and one of the reasons is just because the language is so poetic and memorable. So, you know, even I went to school where I actually went to a Catholic high school, and they had a version of the Bible that it was modern, and still, every time I think of the Bible, I don't remember that version. I remember the other one that everybody kind of hears in movies or anywhere. Because James had become king so young, he was really well educated, and also because his mother had been Roman Catholic, and many of the ruling families in Scotland were Presbyterian, James had a very Presbyterian upbringing. The church in England actually had a lot of Catholic elements to it before James got there. So when Elizabeth was monarch for so long in England, she had to contend with a really big split in her country because her sister, who was Roman Catholic, had been on the throne right before her, and her sister is Bloody Mary, right? So she's the one who was executing Protestants publicly and creating all these Protestant martyrs. So Elizabeth then had to really negotiate between these really extreme Catholics on one side and then really Protestant people as well. And so she did something that everybody remembers now as the middle way. She established this church that looks very Catholic, right? They kept the practice of communion behind an altar. They kept the vestments that priests wear. They made churches very, very ornate and brought in beautiful artwork to churches, had beautiful music. And at the same time, there were Protestants who were very opposed to all of that, but she would have helped them enjoy the church because there was an emphasis also on the Bible, right, the written word. They established a Book of Common Prayer in England that also established what the services would be like. So if you walked into a church in England, if you walked into a Mass service, you would probably think, oh, this could be a Roman Catholic church. But the difference in England was that there is no longer the Pope, right? The Pope is not the head of the church in England. The head of the church in England is the monarch. When James came to the throne in Scotland, this is in the middle of the Reformation still. The Reformation had happened much earlier, and because of the religious Reformation, many people in Scotland who were powerful became Protestants, and in particular they became Presbyterians. James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was very Catholic, and this is one of the reasons why she didn't make it as queen. She was in line for the English throne, but because she was Catholic, she was absolutely not favored because the English had finally become Protestant. Elizabeth was Queen of England for 44 years before James came to the throne, and so that was 44 years of Protestantism in England, and people didn't want to return to Catholicism. At least the ruling families didn't want to. So Scotland was much more divisive, one of the ways that the noble families tried to gain power was through influencing the monarch. And James, as King of Scotland, had to learn to be very, very brutal in the way that he dealt with opposition. So as a Scottish king, he had to be very authoritative and really crack down on any nobles who were going against him. And Scotland didn't have the same type of legal system that England had. When he got to England, he came to a place where there was common law and there was a practice, or sort of a legal practice with Parliament, in that he couldn't make decisions by himself. He had to bring Parliament in. And so that was something new for him there. But in a way that kind of cut down on the divisiveness in England because people had a voice. They could express themselves in Parliament. I'm not sure whether James took advantage of the Reformation or that he had an agenda behind the way he used religion or politics, as much as, I guess because I'm thinking of Henry VIII, who really did, right? Henry VIII, who came before him, really had an agenda for religious reform. So James was sort of using religion to support his political authority, or in Scotland, using religion probably because he had to, because the people who were advising him were also very Presbyterian, right? And that was just part of the culture. So James is sort of a product of his times, where that's one of the political tools that you use, would be, you know, you issue certain types of pamphlets, or you have certain books that you're writing that espouse your religious beliefs and, you know, make that part of the political authority. And then you punish people who go against it. So it is very important. At the same time, he was also very, or actually I should say he was thought to be very unattractive, and he was easily mocked, especially by the English. He had a very thick Scottish accent. When he became older, his tongue was too big for his mouth and he would slobber, and people did not really love that aspect of him. So he was really kind of a man of contradiction. Something that I've always found really interesting about the King James Version of the Bible is that this is the version of the Bible that's used a lot of times to counter homosexuality, to say that it is not godly. And the language that you hear when people are quoting that comes from the King James Version of the Bible. But we know that historically James had an interest in men. He was attracted to men. And it was known by people at the time. I mean, it's certainly been exaggerated. When people critiqued him, one of the things they would go after is that he always had a particular male favorite. And it's just something that he did, but he also was married and he had many children. And so people weren't necessarily worried about it when it came to politics. But I've always found it interesting that he could reconcile it in himself, and I don't really know much about, you know, what he felt about that particular biblical passage.
And I think that it's also interesting because it is following that cycle that just right after he becomes crowned, he starts the writings of the King James Bible. So, of course, with the power that I just talked about that he had within himself, he already had published Demonology at a time where he felt like he had healed something. This wouldn't have come from a place of healing. This would have come, the King James Version of the Bible would have came from a much more empowered position of making change instead of kind of a weaker, I need to prove myself, I need to prove my values, I need to prove this. This would have been a lot more feeling from a place of power for him. It would have been the same time with Pluto in Aries, redefining things, and the Uranus-South Node conjunction. Now, the Uranus-South Node conjunction is very weird, because what it is people obsessed with making radical change, and that's something that he was born with, is almost like, does he really need to make the change to things that were already beautiful? For some reason, he did. He didn't think things were beautiful enough. So it's almost like he used the King James Version of his own Bible, right, his own way of re-beautifying something that was already beautiful. It's like, do we need to keep replanting the same rose in a better way? Do we need to paint the roses red as almost an expression in Alice in Wonderland? It's almost like at this point he has so much power, he has so much energy and vitality with him, and this almost feeling like he is indoctrinated by God to make the greatest change on the planet, that he starts painting the roses red. He starts saying that the roses are not good enough, that the Bible is not good enough, it's not beautiful enough, it's not crisp enough, it's not got the values the way that it should be beautified. And this is at a time where people are starting to beautify things more in the world. We start to see cathedrals be more beautified. We start to see, even the clothes and the attire start to be more beautified, and including the Bible itself. Now, it takes a while for him to get the translations done because there was Latin to bring into English, to also people to rewrite a lot of this stuff to help him. It wasn't like he just sat there and rewrote it himself. So when we actually take a look at when it's printed around 1611, we start to see now Uranus now in Gemini. Now the switch from Uranus to Taurus when it was written in the beginnings of the writings to the printing of it is the exact same transition of Uranus every time there was some really major aspects, like Uranus went into Gemini in 1941 into 42 during the times of when we finished the Uranus and Taurus transit of World War II. And it would have been a very major time for publishing, North Node in Gemini, Mercury, Uranus. I mean, this would have been all about printing, and we would have seen that actually the printing of the King James Bible is almost in many ways kind of the leader or the ship that is the vessel to many other writings of the world, and printing being more normalized and writing being more normalized in the world, maybe not just from a king who has the power to do that, but others starting to see that their expression of writing and communication needs to come out. It would have been a very powerful time for that book. Saturn and Pisces, every time we see Saturn and Pisces, if we use some earlier history that's more closely related to us, is the time in which Nirvana came out and alternative music and leaving the kind of head metal bands and MTV being at its peak. Last time we saw Saturn and Pisces was 1995. It was this, also Friends on NBC. It would have been this time where people really would have been accepting of these new norms, these new writings, these new things. And it would have been a really good time for him to have put this out, especially based off his chart being a Cancer. Saturn was exactly in great trines. And guess what? The same aspect that he was coronated with, Mars in Cancer, is also with Jupiter in Cancer, where Jupiter is exalted, meaning it's at its second best position. And Mars and Jupiter together in medieval astrology or any astrology is always a major power, a major good luck, fortunate aspect. We would have seen those come around his birthday time, and he would have felt at the peak of his whole entire monarch presence at this time. I would say he would have felt the most powerful that he ever did. And I think that when he created Demonology way back, just 20 years prior, or actually it was 30 years prior, he would have felt that at that time it was the best. But that's the irony, is that the Saturn cycle had been coming around since it was Saturn in Aquarius that he started Demonology. 30 years later, you get Saturn in Pisces right here. So it had gone through Aquarius. So it would have been like the changes to the King James Version of the Bible would have had his hands on it more in probably 1609 and 1610, the same way that he had his hands deeply in Demonology at the time that was prior to that. Welcome to High Vibe, Anne. It's a pleasure having you here, and you've given us so much great information about King James and so much that has happened with King James. And I'd like to have an open talk with you today, and any questions that you might have for me, I have questions for you. But is there anything that you want to start off with when it comes to maybe some things that haven't been covered yet that people are going to see in the interviews that you did about King James that people might want to know about that we could start the discussion with?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, first of all.
Yeah, no problem.
And Wow, you went over a lot about James's personality, and I think we'll probably be talking a lot about that. One thing that we haven't quite, or that you didn't discuss yet, was King James's mother, who was Mary Queen of Scots. And there's just a lot about him becoming king, a lot surrounding that time in Scotland and in England and in Europe in general, where this is a time after the Religious Reformation, when there was a split with the Roman Catholic Church. And there's a lot of fighting in Europe during this time. As people and states settle into the new religious paradigms that are emerging, and it hasn't become solidified yet. So during this period of time, just to set a little bit of context, when James is doing the witch trials in Scotland, there is a lot of religious fighting on the continent as well. So there are religious wars that are happening in France that are tearing apart that country. And that's between Catholics, Roman Catholics, and Protestants. Mary Queen of Scots, who was James's mother, happened to be Catholic and married to the French king until the French king died, and then she married one of her cousins. But she was known as a Catholic who was also very threatening to the Queen of England at the time, who was Elizabeth, because Mary Queen of Scots was next in line for the throne.
They just made a movie about this, I think, about 2 years ago,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
And I think we could bring up the screen here so people can see her here. That's what she portrait of her back then. And yeah, she did have quite a very, I would say, dramatic life, very short life too.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how young she died, and all for pretty much this whole idea of control, I guess you could say, for the crown. Is that what you would say it was really about? Although there is some mystery to it, right? If she really was murdered by Elizabeth, isn't that correct?
Right. Yeah. I think also a lot of the recent films, and there was a recent TV show about her, they do a really great job of showing how independent she was and how well educated she was. And she was actually very shrewd, and she was queen in Scotland, where there were a lot of warring, wealthy nobles who could contest the power of the throne. So as a woman, she had to be very, very shrewd and crafty and political on her own.
Wasn't her brother had the throne and was holding it for her while she was traveling back to Scotland after something happened, like she was in France, correct? And then she came back to Scotland. Her brother was in power. She then took the power, and then he tried to take it back on her. At least that was what the movie showed, right?
Yeah. So anytime a monarch had to travel, you had a regent that would be in place for you who would rule. So she had to go to France when she married the King of France.
Gotcha.
So she was very favorable, or thought favorably towards the French, and she was very French culturally and Roman Catholic. And of course, many people in Scotland didn't like that, right? If you were a Protestant. Now, during this era of Reformation in Scotland, there are a lot of people who are powerful who are Presbyterians, which was a branch of Protestantism that kind of believed that power came from the people up. In a Roman Catholic tradition, obviously it goes from the Pope, from God, obviously, to the Pope, down to bishops and kings and all of that. So Roman Catholicism is thought to be really suspicious, because you have the Pope who you're finally going to be beholding to, and that's not good. In Scotland, when you are a Presbyterian, you don't want the Pope to have anything to do with ruling your country. So.
Well, that's what's interesting to me, because since Mary was in France, and that means that she was connected with Catherine, correct? Queen Catherine? And Queen Catherine had Nostradamus on her court and was very, I guess you could say, liberal in the sense of really accepting of his predictions as an astrologer, as a prophet. But they were very Roman Catholic then.
Right. Today, we think those things don't go together. But if you were a strong monarch during this period of time, during the 16th century especially, you had an astrologer on your court, and there were monarchs who had alchemists. It wasn't something that was thought to be evil, right?
Right.
Astrology wasn't just something that was automatically thought to be satanic or something. It was considered one of the sciences you used to consult if you wanted to rule well. And in fact, if we went back to England, when Queen Elizabeth became monarch, her coronation was actually planned around the astrology of the day.
Really?
So that's how they picked her day for coronation.
And so, yeah, and then it's interesting because she had quite that life where even I think her coronation says here it was September 9th of 1543. She was born December 14th, 1542. So she was coronated pretty much within a year of her birth, less than a year of her birth. And then she does get married to, it's the Duke or the Lord Darnley, and he is of France.
He is actually Scottish.
Oh, he's
so
Scottish. Okay.
After her first king dies, or her first husband dies, she marries Henry Lord Darnley, who's actually a cousin of hers, and he's also in line for the throne of England. He is related to the Tudors as well.
And that's him. It's kind of funny, this picture.
Yeah.
She almost looks more masculine than he does.
Right. Yeah.
Very interesting. I just think it's kind of like a very interesting pictures. But then he is killed then, correct?
Yeah, so he was actually, she fell in love with him, and very quickly that relationship became really horrible. And she had a friend who was her secretary, a male Italian secretary, and her husband didn't like him, so he had that man murdered. And I think at that point, Mary was already pregnant with James, who became James I later on. And so their marriage became really horrible. So she obviously hated her husband after that point. And
I remember that from the movie now. Okay.
Okay, now I have to confess that I didn't see the most recent movie. So I remember
that. So there's a picture that's up that I just put up of his death. Yes. It's a very weird, I've never actually seen a painting or drawing of this ever.
This painting is, it's a drawing that shows an event at which Henry was murdered. And this was when Mary Queen of Scots conveniently left, and she had supposedly reconciled with her husband and invited him to this palace. And she just happened to leave that evening, and while she was gone, a bomb just happened to go off in the house, and that's depicted in part of the picture.
Oh, yeah, so up here's the bomb in the house.
Right. Yes. So there's an explosion, and he somehow managed to survive that.
So is that him being walked out,
that's
probably?
Him being carried out, or actually maybe his body being taken off.
Wow.
If you go over to the right and up.
Oh, there's his being buried.
If you go above that is his body as it was found in the garden.
Oh, so it's got like a big burn mark on his leg.
So even though he survived the bomb, and mysteriously he was strangled and stabbed, or the stories all differ about that, but he ended up dead that night. And then Mary ended up marrying a man who she was having an affair with at that time, and So it didn't end too well.
Yeah, she didn't have. So that's pretty much just, then she has to, our main subject here is King James of Scotland, but he's the sixth, King James the Sixth. And so he comes in under a very weird paradigm, I would say. His mother has been possibly murdered by Elizabeth of England.
Oh, and yes, and then later, actually at this point, Mary was still alive. So he's born to a mother who probably had his father murdered, right? And then she has to leave Scotland, and then James becomes King of Scotland when he's 1, right? Because people don't want Mary around after that event. Can't imagine why. They don't want her as monarch.
Right.
And then later on, she's executed by Queen Elizabeth of England. And that is because anybody in England who wanted to raise a plot against the Queen, if they were Roman Catholic, they were doing that and promoting Mary Queen of Scots, because Mary Queen of Scots was in line for the throne. So Elizabeth tolerated that for a really long time. And then, many other movies, and I know the most recent one also shows, and also I think in the second movie about Queen Elizabeth, The Golden Age, I believe, it shows her really debating that she didn't want to sign a death warrant against her cousin, who is Mary Queen of Scots. But somehow she does sign paperwork. I can't remember how it was depicted in all the films, but she signs something, or maybe she doesn't, and she says, "I didn't really mean to kill her," but it was too late. So Mary was executed by.
Yeah, it also showed in the movie that Queen Elizabeth was very lonely and alone. Mm-hmm. Like she spent a lot of time alone. She then started to not trust her, I guess you could say, like her royal court as much. Like she was also too trying to defend her position. 2 strong women at the same time.
Yeah.
Trying to keep order and keep power at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting how James comes into the world with these figures that are in his life very young and already given him the monarch of Scotland at 1 year old, just like his mom. Mm-hmm. And in a turmoil time of religious battling and the crown. And then that, I guess, is, if you were to say, and maybe I should ask you this, it's kind of interesting with that kind of upbringing. I'm wondering how much that would have probably had an effect on him to create demonology, and then to create the King James Version of the Bible, and then to be the monarch of both of the countries at the same time.
Right. Obviously, it has a big impact on him. He grows up as monarch of sort of a less rich country than England, right? The neighboring country is England, where the monarch is one of the richest in the world, and they're having this golden age and prospering, right? And in Scotland, they're up north and kind of fighting each other still for power, and it's a really different situation where the king's power is contested and really depends on having strong uncles and relatives and friends who are fighting for him to stay in power. So it's known that James grew up he knew he would be in line for the English throne. And he really kind of looked at that as this wonderful thing he would one day have, where he'd be in charge of a country that has a completely different church. It's structured very much like the Roman Catholic Church, where the king is the head of the church, not the Pope, right? The king is, or the monarch, and the power comes down from the king. So to James, that seems like an ideal situation.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because looking at his life, it wasn't like he just became king of both countries right away. Mm-hmm. It takes a while for him to even become the king of England. And so he goes through this marriage where he has to go try and get his wife from Norway, and this starts to create this witch trial thing. That just seems very weird. I had done the astrology at a time where Neptune would have been all over his sun, which is very rare, once in a 165-year transit for somebody to have. And not everybody goes through it in their life. And I called it going through some sort of poltergeist moment, And it's interesting that as he's going to get his wife, he feels that these witches are causing problems in order for him to go be with her.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I thought what you said about it was really fascinating. And almost as you're talking about it now, it makes me think of sort of, if you could do a psychoanalytic view of it too, right? Of his view of women and how he has his own mom who's kind of unstable, and she's absent, right? He never gets to be around her. He was taught that she was not a good person, right? That she had wrong beliefs. And the beliefs are what really mattered at this time. And I think you said something about his North Node being in Scorpio,
Yeah.
right? So I was curious about whether that could have been shaped, or does that reveal itself in his view of women from all the way from his mother on up?
It's interesting because, yes, like learning to accept transformation constantly is the lesson of a North Node in Scorpio. Like learning to accept that death and rebirth is constantly part of this life. But he had the South Node in Taurus with Venus, so that's definitely overly connected to wanting to hold on to people. But that North Node in Scorpio is like, you're going to have to let it go in order to continue on with life, and that it's part of life. You just can't keep somebody with you. It almost would be like maybe, you know, in today's culture, somebody carrying the ashes of every single person that's passed away in their life on their chest, like on a necklace or something.
Wow.
That would be almost like how he would have looked at people. So the whole idea of him looking at his wife and the journey there is if it's this prize that can't be had due to the fact that it's from unforeseen witches that he doesn't know about. I'm assuming. I mean, like, I don't think he thinks that he knows the exact location and them doing a seance or something against him and he knows exactly where it is. It's almost like in his own perspective.
The witches were known to be there, though. Like he would have known there were witches on the coast of Scotland doing some sort of bad things, right? And I love when you said the whole poltergeist mind thing, because that's probably how it would have been interpreted by him. I mean, like, and he would have grown up in this world where you have a belief that there always could be someone doing something bad against you, and your power or your status depends on being able to control that, because it was such an uncertain world in which he was trying to maintain that power, right? And he would have been he would have had a regent when he was a child who would have been keeping and maintaining that power for him. And when he then became an adult and could rule on his own, that would have been a really scary situation, especially if you came from that unstable background, right?
Yeah, and so then there's these witch trials that happen in 1579, 1580, and that's at the same time that he does get his wife. I think he does eventually get her, right? It's not like the witches stop him completely.
Yeah, I think it's also 1589. Late 1580s, yeah,
Okay,
when the witch trials are
1589 to
happening.
90.
And then his marriage, right?
And then his marriage happens. And so he does get there. It's not like the witches stop him. And then that's right a year after that, he goes into demonology, writing demonology.
Yeah.
So it obviously had a very huge impact, probably being at the witch trials, right? So maybe go into that a little bit. Like, is there any sense of how many he went to, or he just like kind of, was it like random, kind of just like, it was like a president showing up at a buffet in Vegas or something?
No.
You know?
Right. It would be like, any trial happening in our well, actually, it doesn't quite work in our country, because the president, that we have separation of powers, right? So he would never show up at the Supreme Court, but it would be as if, the president showed up in a courthouse, like at the county courthouse, to preside. Maybe if the Supreme Court justice decided to show up at a county courthouse and take over. James was aware of all of this. He felt personally attacked by it because somebody was trying to usurp his happiness, because being married was something that would have been idealized by him, especially, right? And his queen was over in Denmark, and there were storms at sea, and so and also, it's not like he invented that. There were actually legends about witches, and these are actually Scandinavian legends of witches who would raise storms at sea.
There was also that time period of sea monsters.
Right.
And we see a lot of the old depictions and pictures of that time, and that they were also very connected to even old mythology, going back to Neptune's reign and trident, there's so much that goes into that. And that time period was him going through Neptune's reign. Not only about the seas or the chaos of storms, but also the chaos of the spiritual realm. It all rules that. And he was a Cancer, and Neptune was in Cancer all around where he was born.
It's so how long would it have stayed there?
Well, it has a pretty long stay there. It's about I'd have to do the exact math at that time in the Julian calendar system, but I would say it's about 15 years.
So it would have been there. You said it was like
it would
10
have been
degrees
there,
or something at that point?
Yeah, it would have been there halfway through when this happened. So he would have probably went through it through the whole demonology book writings till it published. From the marriage to the publishing finally of the books. That would have been the peak cycle. And then prior to the marriage, he probably would have felt just more lost, or maybe even being subconsciously driven by different people telling him things, and kind of trying to figure out what's going on. It almost seems like when the peak of the cycle happens for him, it's this moment with his wife and trying to reach her.
Yeah. It was really interesting that you said also in writing demonology, as opposed to writing the Bible, it was like a personal, kind of a personal quest for him, or
like I called it a bandage to a deep, wound in his life. Also a feeling like he had never really been able to maybe express himself, because he has a lot that he wants to express. He's got the moon in Leo, he's got Mars and Saturn, and he has big goals. And with Chiron, where it would have been for him at the time on his south node, if I remember if that's where it was correctly, it would have been trying to heal a lot of these issues that he has about holding on to things and losing them. So in many ways, it's like, this is going to be the thing that gets rid of the things that cause me to lose things in life.
Right. And so much of it really does have to do with that for him, because in writing demonology, he is, it's not only that he's able to provide a document for people to be able to locate witches. So in some sense, it's giving people the ability to control things by saying, here's what witches do, here's where they hide things, and here's, they might look like they're sleeping, but they're actually out of their bodies, cavorting with Satan, right? I mean, he had the specific things to tell people, here's how you can locate witches. So that's giving a sense of control for himself personally, but also it's for society, right? Anyone who then reads the book can help maintain that social order. And he's kind of given that to people as sort of like a gift of, here, I will help you. You will love me because I've given you this information. There will be social order, and there will be religious order because I've given you this book. And yeah, that's very...
And so what are some of the main concepts besides locating the witches and how to try them, basically? Because there were 3 books, were they segmented into different sections, or was it just a continuation of one book just in 3 different parts?
Yeah, it's basically one book in 3 different parts, and they each have a different purpose. The book talks about not only witches, but it talks about werewolves and other creatures.
I think it actually goes into the succubus and the incubus energy too.
Yes.
Which actually in the spiritual community today is used a lot.
Right.
So it's kind of ironic that actually the community that the book goes against actually uses some of the terms and the terminologies and the actual descriptions of them in the community today.
That's really interesting. Now, actually, he wouldn't have come up with the terms, but he kind of collects all of that from existing knowledge about witches and puts that all in there, and demons, right? But what's interesting is at the time, you would also have people claiming to be witches, which I've always thought's fascinating, who claim, yes, I am doing that, right? I can do that. I have that power. So it was a way for people to claim power as well.
because there wasn't a lot to hold on to then. I mean, sure, the Renaissance period was going on, but you had to really be a true artist at that time. And I mean, if you take a look at the artists of the 1500s and going into the 1600s, I mean, their work still lives today. So that would have been pretty hard to. It's not like today, like we have the internet, we have social media. It's like pretty easy for everybody to have a shot. Where back then, it would have been a little bit easier maybe to just say I'm a witch and bang, right?
Yeah.
And I've already created my opposition with this kind of mentality out there that demonology is creating. And
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and there were, of course, healers and people who did do sort of these folk practices to help people. And then there would have been people who would say, yes, I'm going to put a curse on you for doing this. And then, and feel as if they had some power that way.
And he does this before becoming the King of England. So it's very Scottish based. And does this book then eventually reach a lot of the world, or a lot of Europe at least? Does it progress out of the I guess you could say Scottish culture and move, of course, probably into English culture when he becomes king, but does it beyond? Because that would have been also at the same time with, the reign of Nostradamus being what he was doing and finishing up, and, it would have been a really interesting time. It was the 1600s was the whole Galileo trials, and there was a lot that was about to happen.
Right.
And do you think that this book really made it to Europe to kind of create even more ammo for the Catholic Church and the Church of England in many ways against?
Yeah, I think what it's doing is bringing that continental European style of accusing witches. It's bringing that to Scotland, but then also through James bringing that to England. And so it's influential in introducing new ideas about what witches could be doing, and the ideas about demons, right? And what is the evil that is lurking out there. So it's giving people ideas about that. Also, it was influential in shaping people who went on to become witch hunters, right? And other people who wrote kind of guidebooks for judges, because think about it. If you went to school and you were trained in law, you might not have been trained in how to locate a witch, right? So they're using this book to help them figure out, these people are accusing this witch. What do I do next? And part of the book does talk about how to get the witch to reveal themselves, or what are the signs that you look for, and the things that would have become influential later on, like in Salem, in the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, so then bring us now. So he becomes coronated as the King of England, so King James of the First of England, 1603.
Yeah.
And so that's a good 13 years after starting to write and have his marriage. And so now he becomes the king. And at that time, he goes right into the King James Bible. Right. Yeah. Which I think you had brought up that he was very much fascinated by poetry because he was a poet. And so it's almost like he fluffs the Bible up to much more of a dramatic entry, or more beautification, as I called it. Right. Now, I thought that was really interesting. I don't remember what you said. I think I was talking about painting the roses red, a lot like Alice in Wonderland's Queen does. And the whole emphasis on beautification. I don't remember what was the transit you had mentioned that caused that. Well, it was interesting that it was Uranus in Taurus when he became in power, the same way that Hitler did. And it was interesting to me to see that cross over his North Node and cross over or South Node in his Venus and so forth during the time of him building this. And then it goes into Gemini when it's all about publishing and really at that time in life, after I think it was 1611, the King James Bible starts
Right.
to be printed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when we really start to see in history a lot more books being printed that you see at, when I go to museums and I go to see like alchemy museums and so forth. The ones from the 1400s, 15th century, they're much like colorful, right? Like they have to use like real like metals and gold and stuff to create the
Yeah,
book.
they're
Where-
hand done a lot of times.
Right, yeah. Whereas you get to this period and you actually start to see like what we would conceptualize as a book today. I mean, I don't want to say they're the same, but as far as more of, oh, okay, it's just black with black ink with, you know, pages.
Printed, yep.
And it's almost like that King James Bible at the same time you said was also so widely spread because it was translating a Latin Bible into English and bringing that around the world. And it's almost like that just becomes kind of the forefront of him with this trailing caboose of demonology in the background.
Right, yeah. Right, so when he came to England, people would have thought it was really strange. And I want to come back to what you said about that, about how people might have felt when he came as the monarch. But when we look at the Bible being commissioned really quickly after he became monarch, that's because, you know, he would recognize as the head of the Church of England, you know, it's actually kind of giving him some power to be able to do this, to say, I'm going to give my people now, as the head of the church, the very best Bible. And you're right, he was well educated and he considered himself a poet, and this is the era of Shakespeare, so he wants it to be the best language it can be. You mentioned the beautification of the Bible, or of, you know, of
Pretty
that
much
time.
everything that he was probably wanting to touch at that time or communicate, especially having this confidence that he would have had becoming the king, not of England, not because that's just it, but also because he had that Mars with his son
Right.
at the exact coronation moment. It would have been his birthday time right prior to that. And then you see as he goes into the writings of it, you see a lot of stuff come into Gemini, which is all about communication and all about getting it out there. But you see the same in astrology. Saturn is a lot like we call it chronos, or we even call in time chronography, or chronological time, right? Saturn is the one that rules that, and it's on a 28.5-year cycle around the sun. And what's interesting is you see from the Demonology series to moving to the King James Bible, a completion of that one rotation. It's a lot like a stopwatch, and how you can do a new lap on a stopwatch. It's like that. It's like a much more different form, and we see Chiron come into his own sign, and I talked a lot about Chiron being the healer and being in the weird space. It's almost like this is like him feeling confident and much more healed, and not from a place of, my wife and these witches took me over, but now I'm doing things because this makes me feel like I'm doing something beautiful and good. It almost might have been, and I'm going to just predict this as an astrologer, it might have been for him making himself feel better and not so guilty of maybe creating something pretty intense and harsh. Whereas if he really liked Shakespeare and he really wanted to do something in a godly way, it almost is his greatest feeling of creating something beautiful, and that will reach farther than a book like Demonology of having people to go find witches.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in what you just said. And, you know, one thing I find really interesting is that the English church itself would have been more beautiful. So it's not just the Bible and it's not just the language, but when James became King of England, he was actually entering a place where he had more power just in the position of being king. He had the church behind him, and the ritual could support that, right? So in Scotland, there was no emphasis on ritual in a Presbyterian church because that seems too Catholic. But in the Church of England, there's all sorts of ritual I mean, his coronation would have been filled with it, and actually his coronation was in English, so he's also very proud of, which was different because it would have been in Latin before, right?
Right.
So English is a sign of a Protestant church, right? To be able to have your Bible in English, but to maintain all this ritual and the beautiful language makes it so it also retains a lot of the Catholicism aspects that he enjoyed, because you have this church where he's at the head of all these bishops and power comes from him down. So I'm sure he would have felt redeemed, or he would have felt like he hit this gold mine. He would have felt in his power for the first time, because the whole structure supports his power now. He's not having, I mean, of course, yes, he's fighting and there's plots against him, and we are skipping over a lot, but but the whole structure now of the church and the state and the way the laws are support having a monarch at the head.
And there's no more who's who from which country, Scotland or England, like his mother had to go through.
Right.
Right? It's like that's all now settled with him being, well, it would have been interesting to be somebody as a citizen of England and of Scotland at that time, with him being in the reign of both, because Pluto in Aries is about re-identification in extreme ways. With Neptune being in Virgo as well, it would have been a reality that's unknown and changing, and feeling like the physical reality seems almost mystical, but at the same time, also people feeling like, I don't trust it. I don't know if I feel confident with this. This looks a little too weird for me. Last time we saw Pluto in Aries was in the 1880s, and if we take American culture, that's after the Reconstruction, movements happening, and the country's healing itself from going through a civil war. And then you have Grant that becomes president, and he dies in office, and then you're getting into a new century, right? And it's this re-identification moment of, wow, there's a complete West Coast now of states that are on the West Coast, California, Washington, Oregon, and they start filling the territories with states at that time. So it's like the country's going through this whole re-identification of not just being these colonial states that now become independents of a country of the United States, then a civil war, and being about just the North and the South. Now there's this whole thing of the West, and there's this whole connecting with the railroad, and so it would have just been, and it's also the Industrial Revolution starting to come up to its precedence, right? Of holy cow, we're gonna not only having railroads, but we're gonna start to actually create factories. I mean, it takes a little bit of time, but it's that whole lead up into that, which is kind of a way to bridge into, so he's doing this work, he brings out the Bible in his version in 1611, and you get the pilgrims who leave for America, which is not, I don't even think at that time is really known where they're going. They just know they're going across the seas to find religious freedom. But what was the religious freedom they were looking for if he was redoing the Bible to not be Catholic?
Right. Well, the reason that the pilgrims eventually left is because they were not conforming to the religious belief in the way that they were supposed to. So this is a period of time where there's a lot of anti-Catholicism and also anti, super Protestants in England. And so they weren't being tolerated because they didn't want to worship in the style of the Church of England, because they felt like it was too Catholic. It seemed too full of the ritual that they would have called, too popish.
Well, probably, I mean, it's probably hard to tell in history, but I don't know what it would have felt like if he created Demonology, which is very specific and very, a guidebook, almost like, it almost feels like with the King James Bible and how he brings it out. And I mean, you can go in any app for a Bible and use the different versions. And whenever you do go to King James, you'll take a verse. And there is just much more of even the words are more English with yous instead of just how we see it in
traditional English today, as far as maybe more American, or like we see the New Testament stuff, right? It's just like English. That's the old English. And then there is that Shakespearean words in there that you almost have to look up sometimes. Like, well, what does this word mean? So it almost kind of feels like maybe a big show and dance, or like a movie, how demonology kind of might feel that way.
Right.
For somebody who's been just totally practiced and connected to God, now you have this king who, if we can show the picture actually of him, it would have been interesting to have this man, kind of walking around. And I think you had mentioned he had a large tongue.
Yeah, and he wasn't thought to have the best manners of all time. And he was not, he was actually a really talkative guy, and people really liked him, and he would joke a lot, but he was not refined in any way. And he was very different from Elizabeth. I think that, Queen Elizabeth, who had come before him.
She was very elegant, right?
Right. And also really concerned with her image, very aware and very controlled with how she presented herself. And
do you think that maybe Queen Elizabeth II today, even though I know they don't come from the exact same line, it's kind of interesting on how she's very much the same way in today's world, in modern times.
Yeah.
And how she's very concerned about image, including how everybody in the monarch. I mean, even I just did I found out a story the other day that Monopoly is banned in Buckingham Palace because it's too much of an intense
American
game.
Yeah, it's
too intense, is what she says.
Very capitalistic, intense, dog eat dog world. The image thing, I think, when we look at the English monarchs, people think of the Tudors as the first kings of England and monarchs who really understood their image and the power of the image. So Henry VIII also was very aware of how he presented himself. And but Elizabeth had that issue of being a female monarch and coming to power in a country where there had been wars fought previously because there were powerful men who could contest the throne. So she's a woman, and that's thought to be weaker. So she used this idea of the Virgin Queen. And actually, one thing you might find interesting is that, and the whole Neptune and Virgo thing, when James came to the throne, she was a Virgo, and she used the Virgin Queen as one of the ways to talk about her, which was also kind of a way to bring in the Virgin Mary for people who had been Roman Catholic. Now you have your Queen, who you could sort of think of as, your England's Virgin Mary.
Interesting.
But when James came to the throne, I thought that was fascinating because it would have been a huge switch in gender, right? And his style was completely different. And people had for so many years, for over 40 years, been used to Elizabeth's way. And she was very stingy, and in terms of the money she spent, she wasn't as lavish as James turned out to be. And you would have had courtiers who were there to please her as the female monarch. And that actually kind of stayed the same with James because he had his favorite male courtiers, and we can talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear about that for a second, but I wanted to mention this about Mary, because with Elizabeth. Elizabeth actually is from the Tudor line, which is ironic because it is the Tudor line through Henry VIII who does create the Church of England.
Right.
It does do that weird thing where they even, I think, in the movie, the most recent one, go, well, you have your father's blood in you. Like, are you sure you're not going to kill me? That's what they say, like, as if they depict as if Mary would say that to Elizabeth, almost like, are you sure? Like, your dad's blood's in you. Like, he killed his own, family and his wife. So there's that kind of powerful, don't mess with the way things are Tudor line that comes through Elizabeth. But I think, and you're the historian, so I think it's the line that finally kind of takes in all of England the real throne, because there was a lot of places where people were trying to be kings and queens all along England throughout history.
Right.
And it's almost like that's when it becomes to where we're at today, still of the monarch, kind of like the central family that really creates, and probably by using the religious element of the Church of England, creates it as this is the official kingdom and keeps it that way, I guess.
Right, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there does happen to be a civil war, and the king is replaced for a time after he's executed by a commonwealth. But besides that, I mean, that ruling line is really, whenever you have a new monarch, it goes to whoever's the nearest living relative, right? Even
Right.
if it changes family lines. But there's not a war ever fought over who's going to become the next monarch, right? As there had before the Tudors, right? So they had really made a more stable monarchy.
Which comes down to, I think, the way that you establish yourself as a monarch and how well you know also how to play the game, like
Right.
Monopoly. Ironically enough, Queen Elizabeth is afraid of Monopoly.
Well,
yet-
interestingly enough, too, like Henry VIII would have read Machiavelli's book, The Prince, which is Machiavellian, and right, it's all about how do you put yourself in the best light and maintain the power.
Well, and he
right?
also would go and joust, and he would compete against the best jousters.
Right.
Like he would actually play in the sports, and he made himself feel like the people actually rooted for him because they were like, wow, our king he can joust, he would love to go out on his horse and ride horseback and go out and have a good time
Right.
until he got pretty sick and he got overweight and,
Yeah.
he switched pretty quick. But he switched a lot, and I think it's interesting to bring up the Civil War part because that's under the son of King James I of England, which is what, King Charles?
Charles the First, yeah.
And so I have some pictures here of that, which go into. We'll go to that in a minute. Here it is, the execution of Charles, right here. And we'll actually do this little quick thing. This is the English Civil War. So this happens between 1642 and 1651. So this is under Charles. And so this is where it becomes much more powerful to be a monarch, I guess, right? While then there's these people that are asking for more of a parliamentary balance, and it's not going that way.
Right. So James, when he came to England, he had to deal with Parliament, and the English tradition was always the king rules in Parliament. So it's with Parliament. So Parliament had particular duties that only they could do, and James always tried to find ways around that, right? You have to call Parliament in order to raise money for wars or to build your navy or whatever you need. And James came up with some creative ways to raise fees that did not involve calling Parliament. But his son Charles became even better at that and offended people pretty quickly after he became monarch. In 1629, he stopped calling Parliament. He had a Parliament where where the parliamentarians didn't do what he wanted, so he just stopped calling Parliament, and that meant he had to look for other ways to raise money because Parliament, sanctions the taxes that would need to be raised, right?
Well, and I think it's interesting that you say that, and this happens to be 22 years after the Pilgrims leave on the Mayflower, that you start probably as a person back then going, okay, wow, this is a lot. We've now got a king that's of both countries. We now have the demonology, I think, isn't as probably prominent as in people's lives as much as the King James Bible is. And then he sets this precedence with that and sets the stage for the religious energy of England and Scotland. Then he's going around Parliament as much as he can. Now his son takes the throne, and people are like, well, these people have left because of this, right? That would have been like the first time you really see defectors of your own countrymen. Like, they just got on a boat and pieced out of here, and they start hearing the new world because people start coming to Jamestown, right? They start funneling over that 20 years. So you're starting to see people leave,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And then this happens, and then you get to a point to where on this picture right here, this is actually the picture of Charles where he is beheaded in front of the whole entire, I guess you could say, I mean, it's not the whole nation, but as far as like everybody.
Well, and everyone in the nation's depicted there. Every type of person is
And
there,
so that's it
right?
there, right?
Yeah. So I think the first time we talked about this, you had talked about the astrological transits of this particular time.
Yeah, I think this was a Neptune-Pluto opposition.
Where you said the people would have been kind of mystified about what in the world's even happening, right?
Yeah, and it would have been a time of extremes when it comes to separation. So this would have been like the most extreme feeling of civil war over extreme separatism, more than we probably see from an American Civil War, even though that seems extreme about slavery and so forth. It was just about slavery, right? This would have been about religion, to the way the whole government works, to the way, right? It's the whole
social
It's the
order.
whole entire social order, opposed to, I don't want to call slavery just a singular thing, because it's not at all. It's a very deep and rich, part of the culture that people did not either want or did want. But it was also ironic that when Jefferson Davis becomes the president of the Confederate States of America, they copy everything that America is, but just want to keep the slaves. Like, I mean, they copy as much as they can.
Right.
Whereas this is quite opposite. This is complete trying to say, well, no more monarch. But then I'm just wondering, how does the monarch come back in if they behead a king? Do they find another monarch?
Well, I mean, what ends up happening is they behead their monarch, and Parliament. There's Oliver Cromwell within Parliament who establishes a Commonwealth, and that rules until he dies. And then the problem was they hadn't really thought of how do you pass on a Commonwealth, and that picture that we looked at, it shows the king getting his head chopped off, right, and fundamentally changing the social order there. But the problem is that people are probably shocked about it, but doesn't quite change their notion of how authority works, right? So they still think, well, there's got to be someone ruling society, because nothing changed that cultural perception. And when Oliver Cromwell's son tried to take over, he didn't have the charisma that Oliver Cromwell had, and then there was no basis on which he could rest his power because there was no tradition, right? So the monarch came back, and this was Charles I's son who comes back, and that lineage just continues because people didn't know what else to do, because that was so ingrained for so many years.
That makes sense.
That you always have a monarch. It connected to your religious beliefs, right? So
it would have been a time where, if I look at this from astrology, it's the last century. The 17th century is the last one where we still have not found an outer planet in our human psyche, which that happens in the 1700s with the use of a telescope. So this would have been the last bit of people realizing they don't understand how to use freedom truly in many ways. It's like, oh, wait, we need some sort of power to make sure that there's order with people. People don't know really how to do it themselves.
right, there's no structure in place there yet. There's no state structure that could maintain the power, right? There was the
Right.
church structure still. It had become more
But they
Puritan,
had left that, and
but
they'd given the power to the king for that. Now
Yeah.
they've gotten rid of the king, and they don't want to go back to the Pope, so they're kind of in a...
Yeah, well, the churches were still there, and in the Commonwealth, it just became more puritanical. In a lot of ways, they really tried to regulate people's morality under the Commonwealth in ways they hadn't with the monarch. So it didn't work with the way people celebrated their year. Everything was around the church, right? Your church festivals all had to do with saints' days, and the Puritans who had taken over didn't believe in all of that, so it didn't quite work.
That makes sense. It's almost like it kind of dulls everything out, flattens a lot of the things out, especially if you have James who's bringing this more Shakespearean you know, there's probably a lot more hymns and songs and a lot more, even the Bible's now been propped up much more with beautification and all that, and he's a little bit more flamboyant, and then even with Charles who's doing that, and then you get rid of that, and then you take Puritans, and always when I think of Puritans I think of just a black suit with a buckle and a hat, and you know what I mean, like, and it just kind of becomes very flatlined. And then you get a Commonwealth, and you get people kind of like, well, like, okay, what do we do next? And that's what's ironic is you get to the 1700s, and you do get to an American Declaration of Independence in 1776, and that's when Uranus has been found, basically. It's like right in that time period, and you actually see people willing to create their own structure of people, and it's America who does that first.
Well, I was thinking as you were saying something about this era in particular being different and kind of there's a transformation like in the 1880s in our country. And it's also the era in which colonialism really begins, right? Like you mentioned Jamestown.
Right.
But there's more world exploration. The East India Company really takes off, and England and all the European states are exploring around the world and bringing back that knowledge. So
yeah, the Dutch and the English are competing, and actually the Dutch during the time of James were the kings of trade and colonizing places more, and England almost had to step it up,
right?
Because even the Mayflower was a Dutch boat.
Right.
Like they had the compact signers had to get it from Holland to.
And that's where they had gone to be tolerated when they had to leave England. Right.
So, but it's ironic because you talk about the East India Company, the Dutch had the West, like the West or Dutch East.
The Dutch had their own version.
Yeah,
right?
They had the East of the Indies technically, and the British had the West.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thing where that's what kind of pulls everything to a whole different place and spreads the Bible everywhere.
Yeah.
Is through that.
And even the Pilgrims or the Puritans who came over, right? They brought the King James Bible, even though they were more low Protestant type of believers.
So to close this up, it's pretty amazing on how powerful King James' reign was and the effect of what he did for literally till even now effect with the Bible. And there is that background of demonology that I would say, as somebody in the spiritual community and has a spiritual network, there are so many terms in there and things that were actually pretty dead on with what spiritual people use to look at what we like to call bad energy or negative energy. So it's kind of ironic on how a lot of those terms and a lot of those things in there actually are used, which he would have heard from witches then. But you say that he's not looked at in English tradition as one of the more powerful kings, right? I mean, he's kind of like not.
He was an influential king, and a lot of important things happened during his reign. But I don't think people ever look back and think, yeah, James is my favorite monarch, right? He's, we think of the Bible. That's what we think of, right? People are always shocked about demonology in particular,
Well, I don't think that, I don't know, whenever you think of a monarch or something, you're not going to base it based upon, I would say, maybe the Bible, right? Like, ooh, he did the Bible. Like, it's always like, which war was won or what, I mean, with Henry, there's the whole drama of changing and leaving the Catholic Church and, killing his wives and stuff. And there's just a lot that happened in that time period. And I'm looking forward to continuing to do more series and even have more talks about this, because you and I can talk about this for 5 hours straight.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are going to want to know a lot of this, especially I want to go into the sonos of
Shakespeare
to... We can go in so many different directions, and I feel that it's beautiful to be able to speak with you about these things and to help people take into their own consideration, to a deeper look at history and to see how it affects us today spiritually. And in these crazy times we're going through right now, that, you know what, you look at history, they were going through them just as much as well too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any last words that you have regarding King James here at the end here? And we will leave with his picture up here of maybe you. Or actually, you know what? Before you go here, we leave. This is what I want to understand this. So in the Bible, it's very against, homosexuality, but King James had a male lover, correct?
Yeah. He.
Who is the man that I am showing on the right here?
Right. This is George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, who was his companion and lover. He was much younger than James, and he was also a male favorite of Charles I. So he and then he was eventually assassinated because of this.
So you mean he hooked up with?
I don't think he hooked up with Charles I.
I was going to say, so this guy hooked up with the dad and the son?
No, he was his. It was sort of like when you get to be buddies with your stepfather. Maybe he was his dad's companion, and then he also, if you wanted to stay in power, you had to become really close with the Prince of Wales, the person who's going to become king, right?
Right.
So yeah, he was a smart political mover and shaker.
Interesting.
And James had male favorites before him, but he just was sort of the most ostentatious. And in that picture, you could see that he had his white silk stockings, and he was thought to be very handsome and dashing. And I think he was noticed by James when they were out on a hunt.
Well, and he obviously wrote too. It looks like he's holding some notes.
It's probably a letter from James. Oh. I mean, because James wrote letters about how much he loved him, and that's very ornate, right? A very 17th century stylish hat.
Yeah, I was gonna say, almost even going into 18th century, like it's like kind of bridging the fashion. If this was fashion-y, he was that looks like going into the 1700s, like
right. And it's also what he's wearing is really Catholic as well. It's very or very sort of Spanish influence, or with the lace and very ornate.
But this is that last question I have to close this is, because if he's writing the Bible, but he's not the full writer of it, right? He's hired, I don't even know if he hires, but
he commissions the Bible to be translated by a group of secretaries, really.
So these secretaries are doing it, and it's almost like he's kind of just managing it. Like, okay, you got that good. Oh, about that homosexual. Well, we got to keep it. It's been there. Just keep it rolling. I'm going to go hang out with him right now. He's got his white suit on. Goodbye.
No. I think you're right.
That's my question: is how does he take ownership of it, or how do people take ownership of using the King James Bible and to use this part, and they get all crazy about whether it is astrology that says it's not good in the Bible to homosexuality or whatever there might be that is not, it's condemned by God actually, yet he's doing the things that God condemns and writing those things.
Right. Well, there's a lot of people will be able to find all sorts of stuff about this out there. There's a lot of research, but what I can say is that he professed his love for this guy and loved him very much, and people talked about him as his lover, right? But there's a fine line in the Bible. It is against sodomy, and so what I think people have said is that James, I'm not sure whether this is true or not, but would have said that they never actually engaged in the act of sodomy. So I don't know. I don't know what they were doing. So he more had like
a best friend kinship.
Well, it was more than that, right? So it used to be explained away as that, sort of in the 19th century when people were Victorian and didn't really want to talk about that. But I think now we recognize that there was a more passionate love between them. But James could have understood it himself as, well, I'm not going that far, so I'm not sinning against the Bible, right?
Which is all in his own conceptualization of that.
Right.
since he is in power.
Well, I mean, and he's the head of the church. So,
Yeah.
but and the other thing to keep in mind is that not everyone would have known about it.
Right.
It was something that diplomats came to the court and sort of gossiped about it and wrote back about it. People who were elite and who knew James or who came to the court would have seen it. But you're more concerned about keeping power, right? So you want to
Right.
ingratiate yourself to the monarch and stay in power, and you're not going to go around condemning him for that unless you're raising a plot against him. And if you're doing that, you run the likelihood of being executed. So,
Because
you know,
there's lots of lords and there's lots
Yeah.
of people
Yeah.
who back it because they get paid and they get money and they get land allocated to them and so forth to
yeah,
back that monarch. The more you back that monarch and you're on the royal court and you're a lord or you're, let's say, even part of the church or part of any of that, like, yeah, if you run a plot up against it, you got to get all those people to get with it in order to take
Right.
it over. And that's not easy.
yeah, and
And there was a lot of betrayal back then of like people like kind of, that's the beginning of, I would call it like, you know, where you work on both teams, kind of like when you're a double agent, right? And be like, oh, yeah. I understand. Yeah, we're going to do that. And then, nope, I turned you in. And
Oh, yeah.
Because
And
actually, that's what
meanwhile,
Henry was dealing with.
Henry VIII.
Eighth, because he had a bishop that was an English bishop but worked for the Catholic Church, and he was like his lookout. He was
Right.
always his lookout,
And then he failed
and then
in
he
the biggest
failed,
task.
and then he almost made the excuses that he failed in order to get out of his marriage and leave the church. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But he did protect him from almost getting killed or betrayed, and he would play kind of double-headed, like, oh, and then he would say, here, I showed him all. I was really into the show The Tudors, but anyway, we can go
can
for
talk
hours
about
on
that.
this, but I think that
Yeah.
this has just opened up a can of beautiful information for people to start to, especially here on High Vibe, and to introduce you and your work, to help them see, because I think that there's still a lot of unanswered questions that people might have. So I'd love for people to put their questions here on High Vibe in the comment section, or if it's on the YouTube as well. So maybe we can address them always when we do these docu-series, kind of we can address the previous episode as we go to the next one and so forth.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what people think and, you know, what people are curious about also.
And I would love to know what you have to think about all that. So
Yes, I can't wait to talk more about this.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for all of your research, all your dedication to history, and, you know, all the work that it does become to be a professor, and to also be a professor at a university and to teach it, and to not only do that, but to just keep climbing in your escalades as a professor and a beautiful human being that you are, and the greatness that you share to the world.
Well, thank you, David.
No
And
problem.
Thank you for all the beauty and wonderful things you share with the world as well, especially these days.
Oh, well,
Thanks.
thank you. Well, I was going to say in King James style, God bless everybody.
Yes. I can't come up with something. I'm sorry.
No problem.
All right. Thank
Take
you.
care.